This podcast will deal with Sheila and the changes, if they indeed do occur, that seem to come over her during Act 1. I want to look at her character in general, but I want to focus on the way in which we see her character change and the significance of that in terms of the plotting and the characterization of the play. In Act 2, the inspector tells us, when answering a question of Mrs. Burling, that the young ones are more impressionable. Mrs. Burling is surprised to hear this, but this quotation sums up both the dramatic and the metaphorical direction of the play itself. When I talk about the metaphorical direction, I'm of course referring to the action on stage mirroring, if you like, politics and political arguments that were prevalent both at the time of the setting of the play, but also at the time of its writing in 1944. The idea is that if we work on the young will then re-educate the old, and the new system will take over. Now that method, if you like, of indoctrination of the young was the way in which leaders such as Stalin held on to power, but also we've seen it in Korea with Pol Pot and many radical leaders who, in order to start, if you like, a revolution to overthrow a method of government which has been going on for some time, will tend to aim at the young. And we can see it in most periods of history that we care to look at. We will see it again in this play, where the young ones indeed do seem to be more impressionable. This will, in time, as we get towards the end of the play, of course, throw up the idea of a split between the old and the young in their attitudes to collective responsibility and whether or not we should all share a piece of the guilt for the death of not just the one Eva Smith, but, as the inspector tells us in Act 3, the millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths that inhabit the earth. Looking at Sheila, then, we discover at the opening of the play in Priestley's stage direction that she's very pleased with life. Priestley doesn't say that much about her, but he gives us this as perhaps to signify a young girl without many cares in the world. We know that she's part of a wealthy family of high status. She is enjoying her engagement party. She's teasing and flirting at the same time, described again as half playful, half serious. Rather typical of the life of the rich. No great cares. We see perhaps in the incident early on with Gerald and the ring that he has bought her. Is it the one you wanted me to have? They've obviously been discussing this. There's an element here of materialism about her. There's an element here of her looking at life as just this event after event that work to her favour. This, of course, is something that is contrasted very sharply once the story of Eva Smith is embarked upon by the inspector. We should probably remember when we're reading that Eva and Sheila are going to be approximately the same age. To all intents and purposes, they are the same. They are both young girls. The difference, of course, is in their social status and therefore their outlook. We notice from the stage directions, Priestley continues to help us with Sheila's character when she re-interrupts the meeting between Inspector and Burling on page 16. She is described as being, as entering gaily. She comes in. There's an element of enjoyment about everything she does, an element of relaxed enjoyment about everything she does. On page 17, however, when the inspector tells her bluntly about the disinfectant and the several hours of agony. "Oh, how horrible. Was it an accident?" she says. Now, I wonder, is she moved by this or not? I think at this point she probably still isn't. This is probably a straightforward, "Oh dear, how horrible. And was it an accident?" Because these things don't tend to happen to people like her. She would probably assume it was an accident. The inspector tells her more. And very quickly, she begins to get distressed. She begins to want to question her father. And we see, after her initial response, that she looks beyond the selfish attitude that the Burlings have so far shown to this whole issue. We see that she doesn't accept Burling's attempts to sort of brush the whole thing off. And indeed, she also begins to respond to the inspector and wonders of him, what do you mean by saying that, i.e. the repetition of the girl being dead? You talk as if we were responsible. Burling does not like this. He tries to take the inspector away to a corner, and Sheila stops him. Partly, I think, because she is already feeling a degree of responsibility. Indeed, as she says at that point to Burling, it's one of us now. This is bottom of page 18. She is feeling that she is part of whatever is going on. The inspector watches, listens, continues to tell the story of Eva Smith. He doesn't move straight into questioning Sheila. He ensures that he has her sympathy. He tells the story of Eva. His knowledge is detailed and precise throughout page 19 and 20. Indeed, on page 20 we must notice, or you rather must notice, I suppose I don't really have to, but you must notice, that when he's talking about the job at Millwoods, he is at pains to point out the positive nature of this job. All the verbs are positive. It was a nice change amongst the pretty clothes. She was making a good fresh start. All the rest of this language is so positive, and he rubs it in to Sheila. You can imagine how she felt. He says, yes, of course. Burling is still not sympathetic. And it's only at this point that the inspector, having ensured that Sheila is already very sympathetic to Eva's situation, is going to let her suffer what happens. He's drawn her attention and our attention on page 19 to the lot of what he calls a lot of young women working in factories, and a sort of foreshadowing of his closing speech. And he has built up the sympathy for Eva before simply telling Eva what happened and showing her the photograph. Sheila runs out, affected, in tears. And the gentlemen are left on stage wondering what is going on. It's very obvious that Sheila has recognised the picture. The men are protective of her. Once again, we get this repetition of the fact that they were only having a few drinks. What a lovely, relaxed evening it was before the inspector arrives. And what Priestley is doing here is ensuring that we want to know what happened. He is deliberately delaying the information. The tension is building up. The family are showing a slightly unfortunate behaviour pattern in terms of either going into denial or discussing their drinking all the time. We want to know what happened. We want Sheila to come back in, and eventually, at the foot of 22, she does. The inspector questions her. But again, it's a different way to some of the other questioning that we'll see here. Broadly speaking, Sheila tells her story with a small amount of prompting by the inspector. He asks a question here and there to get the next chunk of story out. We know that he knows what happened because of the detail with which he's told us about Eva's life. But it is Sheila herself who will, if you like, confess her actions. And I think that that is important. She is acknowledging that she has done wrong. Sheila acknowledges and says that she has changed. Indeed, the inspector, certainly as you read through 24, seems to be taking on the demeanour of a judge rather than an inspector. Certainly this is almost like a prosecuting examiner just asking the question and letting his client dig their own hole. Sheila is upset. She shouts at Eric. No longer is this the light-hearted banter of the first piece of the play. This is now genuinely upset. We see, not for the first time at the top of 25, one of the inspector's targets, as it were, end a passage with a rhetorical question. Why had this to happen? The inspector, as is his way, simply re-asks the question before moving on. He said, why had this to happen? That's what I asked myself tonight when I was looking at the dead girl. And I asked myself, why did this have to happen? And on we go. Sheila is effectively speaking to us. And the inspector answers her question, whilst at the same time pointing out that it's a question that he too had asked. At this point, with Sheila worn down, though not yet necessarily fully converted to the inspector's point of view, the inspector takes over and continues the conversation. He, when answering Sheila's question, begins to talk about Eva losing her job at Burling and Company, and he introduces the name Daisy Renton for the first time. We know from Priestley's stage direction that we must notice Gerald give himself away. Of course, we assume the inspector knew that already. On stage, nobody else did. Sheila sees it at the same time as we do. And just to digress briefly, I've talked before about this being a well-made play where the audience and the characters are taken from a state of ignorance to a state of knowledge at the same time. This is a very good example of it. We see, as Sheila sees, that Gerald knows this girl. The fact that one or two of the other people on stage don't perhaps pick it up is neither here nor there. Sheila does, and we do. It's a very strong and a very good example of this being a well-made play. Anyway, Daisy is brought into the conversation, and the inspector takes the opportunity to leave the room, leaving Gerald and Sheila on stage on their own. Again, Priestley is masterly here in terms of the construction of the play. We're approaching the end of the first act. We've had something in the region probably of 45 to 50 minutes of play, and the audience need a break. Priestley ensures, by the way this act ends, that of course all anybody is going to talk about in the interval is what Gerald might have done that has meant that he knows Daisy. We've had hints, we've had from the very beginning when Sheila is teasing him, this lovely foreshadowing of what's to come when Sheila mentions early on that time in the summer when Gerald wouldn't go near her. At the time she's saying it with a smile and a laugh, but of course the truth is bitter and it is sad, and we're going to come across that now. But before that happens, we get the wonderful cliffhanger that is the end of Act 1. Gerald tries to pretend that he doesn't know the girl. Sheila is very plain, points out straight away that no, you knew her, but you knew her very well, otherwise you wouldn't look so guilty about it. When did you first get to know her? Gerald doesn't reply. Sheila has almost taken on the role of the inspector here. She seems to know everything. She's worked out for herself. Was it after she left Millwoods, when she changed her name? Were you seeing her last spring and summer during that time when you hardly came near me? This is all page 26, a very important page for this build-up of tension. The questions are building. Gerald doesn't reply again. Eventually, and obviously thinking of this play, as drama, the pauses where he doesn't reply can be as long as the actors can sustain them, before Gerald finally says, "I'm sorry, Sheila, but it was all over and done with last summer. I don't come into this suicide business," he says. This advances the plot, as well as also making us wonder, how can he be so sure? What else is going to come out? Gerald's immediate reaction, because it's the immediate reaction of all the capitalists in the play, and because he's slightly older than Sheila, is to try and keep it from the inspector. Sheila, rather hysterically, she's lost control. "Why, you fool, he knows. Of course he knows, and I hate to think how much he knows that we don't know yet. You'll see," and then this repeats, "you'll see." Now, I'm sure, depending on how you want to stage the play, one of those "you'll sees" will be directed at the audience, albeit possibly indirectly. But this, again, is this emphasis on the well-made play. You'll see, she says to Gerald, you'll learn, you'll move to a state of knowledge. So will you, members of the audience, at the same time. And we pick it up. She looks at him, it says in the stage direction, almost in triumph. Now that is a curious stage direction. It's worth dwelling on for a moment. Why would she be being triumphant? What is this? Is this triumphant because she's worked out the problem? Is this triumphant because she's put him in his place? Is it triumphant because she has, in a sense, acted as the inspector's proxy for a page and made Gerald confess? All we know is that at the moment of her triumph, whatever causes it, the door opens, the inspector walks back in. He looks steadily, searchingly at them and says, well. And at that moment, just as we're thinking, oh, great, we're going to find out what's happening, and the pace has picked up and all the rest of it, up to the end of the act, the curtain drops. And we're left in suspense, thinking, well, what? How can you end an act on a rhetorical question? Why would you end an act on a rhetorical question? It's very obvious, of course. It sustains tension. It keeps us thinking. And of course, when we get to the beginning of the second act, which we'll come on to in the next podcast that I make for you, we will see the second act starting with that same word, well. No time will elapse between the end of Act 1 and the start of Act 2, and the structure of the well-made play moving on in continuous time will be maintained.